Hey, it's Bob. Welcome back to Let's Talk. Today, let's talk about critical incident management. Come on. Hey, welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to talk about crisis management or critical incident management. We'll keep it in the context, I think, today of more around the private sector and how private sectors talk about critical incident management.
So we're not going global crises, and
No.
we're going to keep it closer to home.
Yeah, we're just going to stick to one. And what Katie's bringing up, and it's a good point, like you can go all over the place of crisis management and critical incident management. In the government, it was a whole bunch of other stuff. In the private sector, it could be a few things. It revolves, I think, a lot nowadays around cyber and stuff, but I think we're going to keep it right there for today.
So you're talking about when things are on the line in your business environment, financially, operationally, crisis events that are occurring on a daily basis.
Yeah, I mean, let's make it not necessarily a daily basis, but let's talk about, I mean, when I say crisis, I mean, it's something that could shake the ground of the company that you're in. And it's something that everybody needs to sit up and take notice of immediately. That's what I'm talking about, because I think in those situations nowadays, they come so quickly compared to 10 or 15 years ago, especially when we talk about cyber or the different types of breaches and malware that's out there nowadays. But really, it's anything, in my opinion, that automatically changes the stakes of the moment to a very high stake around the company, right? In other words, is this going to stop the way the company works? Is this going to be a critical business interruption? Is this going to destroy our client base? It's really something that completely potentially can overwhelm the company, all the men and women in it, and you might have to bring outside people in to help you. Because I think the truth is nowadays, when it comes to any type of critical incident or critical incident management or crisis management, you really need to be thinking ahead. You need to think out in front of the train, out in front of the car you're driving, because resilience or thinking about that beforehand, way before the storm hits, is very important nowadays.
What do you mean about the resilience element?
The one thing I can say, honestly, for years in the private sector, I ran different companies. One really was a crisis management company, but we responded a lot to different cyber incidents. And I really think a lot of people in leadership teams, even with the tremendous volume of these type of attacks nowadays, don't stop and ask themselves, like, what if? What if we get attacked tomorrow? What if I can't pay payroll? What if I can't communicate with my clients? They don't take that time. And I think that time to set that up at the beginning of any kind of company is a big deal. The what if question is a big deal.
It doesn't always have to be this gigantic event, like I got hit with this massive cyber attack. What if I can't deliver that service to a customer? What if I don't get the supply I need from a third party, vendor that's critical to my operations?
Yeah, or what if a critical system fails? What if the market tanks? What if financially we thought we were going to have these revenue streams coming in, and all of a sudden because of tariffs they stop? And maybe you've tried to build scaling around that, and all of a sudden it's not there. What if your employees walk out? What if there's a strike? What if they can't come to work? The pandemic, right? I ran a company during the pandemic. Those issues were real. And the ability to try to move the crisis to a position that you can actually handle it, I think is a big deal. And I think a lot of this, quite frankly, again, it goes back to if you're in the leadership team or if you're talking about how do you go about managing a crisis, I think a lot of it is talking about what if. And I just don't think people do it. And I don't know why, to this day, it baffles me, quite frankly. I think there's leadership challenges there. Maybe it's just because they don't have time. Maybe they don't want to talk about it. Maybe they just think it's never going to happen to them. But I mean, I think strong leaders and people in companies that really are looking way out in front of the train, like I said, I think they do take the time to prepare for that type of crisis before it hits. There's a lot of key principles that you got to look at. There's a lot of ways to actually handle crisis management and critical incident management when the chaos is going on. I could tell you from doing thousands of cyber breaches, the time to have a conversation with your team is not the day the crisis hits. I can't tell you how many big boardrooms, and it would surprise the living daylights out of people in this country. I mean, gigantic companies, multi-gazillion dollar companies. You see them in the middle of a crisis, they look like kids on a schoolyard. They're screaming at each other. There's no continuity. They can't communicate. By the way, this is real. I'm not making this up. I've sat in boardrooms a lot. And that's what you see. And these are multi-gazillion dollar, a lot of brilliant men and women running these companies. But, they haven't taken the time to ask themselves, what if something goes wrong? And, I think one of the things we really should take a minute, to talk about today, Katie, is just, what's the preparedness like? What are you doing to kind of prepare for a critical incident management or a crisis management event inside your company?
Well, and I think you've seen it probably proven over and over again. The difference between an A player and a B player is really that focus on preparedness, right? It will make the organization more resilient and able to withstand the event that they're facing. But oftentimes it's less expensive, and they can quickly recover and get back to normal much sooner when you've had these conversations before the storm hits, as you said.
No, I agree. I mean, look, a crisis, put in simple terms, because everybody's going to have a different idea of what a crisis of the day is. I mean, it's a sudden stoppage and disruption of all business activity. I don't really care what it is, and I don't care how it was caused. That's almost tangential to what we're talking about. And I'm not getting into personal threats of employees. I'm not talking about facing unprecedented political action or anything. I'm talking about just a simple act of running a business, paying payroll, and dealing with your clients, that it's completely been disrupted. And now what are you going to do? And what was your plan? There was a breach is just announced, or at least they called it an IT incident with Victoria's Secret today, where they shut the whole website down for 5 days. Well, whether it's an IT incident or whatever, how in the heck can you shut down Victoria's Secret's website for 5 days?
But their earnings were still good because they haven't.
It blows me away. The earnings are still good. People are still buying their product. No one even, and I think it's almost sensory overload. You and I have talked about this. I mean, I think nowadays with critical incidents, a lot of it revolve around like ransomware, malware, cyber breaches, and a bunch of other stuff. But I think there's a numbness to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And the pros and cons, what the cost is to the business. What do we need to do as a business, and how do we invest in this, and what's the tipping point.
But that happens now, and you see that on TV so much. I think there's a complete numbness to it. And I think some people think, it's never going to happen to me. I don't have any intellectual property. I don't have any trade secrets. And I know we're going to do a lot of podcasts on trade secrets and intellectual property, and how do you stop that? How do you protect your company from insider threats and stuff like that in the real world? But the reality is, I don't think anybody takes that time. Now, I have seen a few companies do it and do it really well. I got to tell you, in all the thousands of companies I've dealt with, a lot don't. And they don't take the time. Again, you don't need to have some crazy board meeting. You don't need to have like all this stuff written down. You need to have a conversation with your team to talk about, like, what if? What if something happens? What if our website goes down and we have an IT incident, or we have some type of a breach? And by the way, like, is our point of sales 90% through our website? Their earnings are still good, but are they? Let's see what they report next quarter, And so I think the reality there is, I think that's one big thing. And I think the other thing is, you have to be prepared in any critical incident, I don't care what it is, to leverage expertise both internally and outside of wherever you work. It doesn't matter if it's the government. I don't care if it's a private sector company. As the boss, when you're looking at a critical incident and you're trying to manage this, you need to have a team. And you need to understand what team you need. And so you may or may not have those resources inside your company. And so if you're hunting and pecking for this stuff in the middle of a tragedy, or in the middle of some giant business interruption, or in the middle of everything going down and not being able to talk to your employees or talk to your clients, you're in a world of hurt. And I think you need to understand that you can't do this alone. I've seen so many people try to do all this on their own, right? I'm the boss. I'm the head guy or gal. I'm the one that's supposed to have all the answers. I think one of the biggest things is no, you don't have all the answers. And quite frankly, it empowers your team. It actually empowers you when you start bringing in people that you've vetted and talked to way before an incident ever happens to say, you're going to be on my team when all hell breaks loose, right? Because I want you there because I know I don't have all the answers.
Yeah, I think there's two critical areas where I see that come into play over and over again. One is on the legal side, because you may have the best general counsel there to protect your company, but when it comes to a cyber breach or some type of unexpected crisis that's not part of your day to day, having that legal counsel, already having a relationship with them so they know your business and can help guide you through that incident. And then same when it comes to communications and how you're going to, communicate to your stakeholders, to your employees,
I agree.
Across the board. Again, you may have a wonderful team and they know how to market your company inside and out, but from a crisis perspective, what do you need to do to maintain that trust and confidence?
I couldn't agree with that more. I will tell you in almost every, and I'll just stick with cyber for a second, in every single solitary major, like just gigantic cyber breach or interruption I've been involved in, and I've been involved in thousands of these things over the years, every single general counsel in any company I've seen is completely overwhelmed. And they're not overwhelmed necessarily from the breach itself, but I can guarantee you the CEO, the board, and everything else that's going on around there is tasking them left and right. And so the ability to delegate that to a firm or individual that does nothing but that, now they might report to the general counsel, they may or may not, depending on how the breach unfolds. But I think your point is well taken. And by the way, that is going to hit every single officer in the company, because there's going to be operational needs for the COO. There's going to be financial needs by the CFO. The CEO is going to be getting asked questions from his investors, stockholders, board. He or she is going to be interacting with every, Tom and Jerry out there to figure out what's going on. And I think that's a big deal. And I think you need to make sure that you've spread this out. You need to anticipate and you need to prevent. And I can't say that enough. Ask what if, anticipate, and try to prevent. And don't do it on your own. You can't, and have people on retainer and people that you can actually bring in, because honestly, that's why it's a crisis. You didn't know it was going to happen.
And you can have those retainers in place and be able to just have all the contracts, everything outlined so you know exactly what to expect when a crisis happens. It doesn't mean you have to be, using them on that day, but you have that partner in place when something does occur.
100%, and if anybody doesn't listen to another word I say, besides you can't do it alone and you got to ask what if, you need to take the time to identify upfront what you're vulnerable about. You need to be thinking about that. And the reason I say that is because if you identify where you're vulnerable, if something goes wrong there, that's the people you need to have on retainer, right? You may or may not have that for the entire company, but if you've identified or at least taken the time to think about what are my vulnerabilities, I know where I need to go to get people to help me. I know where I can't do this alone. Otherwise, I got it internally. You need to take those few minutes to do that. By the way, this doesn't take hours. This doesn't take a long time. You get the leadership team together and you do it. Unfortunately, I got to tell you, I've not seen it and I don't get it. I don't understand why. You want to mitigate and minimize, right? Mitigate, minimize whatever is going on for just a pure business continuity state. But really, the leadership role in a crisis is sort of the big picture, overall arching, what's going on. Don't get dived down into too many things and get your, tunnel vision off to the side. You need to be touching everything that's going on, but you don't need to be micromanaging it. And I think one of the biggest things that a leader can do along those lines is to have a pre-established crisis communication plan. That's one of the biggest things you can do. It really is. Because if you're not communicating with your team, and by the way, your team may be a whole bunch of people that are in or outside of your company, no one's going to know what's going on. And when no one knows what's going on, what happens? Fear, people speculate, whether that's your employees, whether your clients, whether it's your lenders. I cannot tell you how many big breaches I've been involved in where within days, the constituents or the people that have stock in the company is suing the company, right? They're suing everybody on the board. They're suing everybody that's involved in this thing. And by the way, the breach or the interruption or the business problem has become a crisis. That's not even begun to be fixed. So the reality is you have so much stuff coming at you as a leader in these things. A crisis communication plan, who's doing what when, way before that kicks off, is a big deal. It really is.
Yeah, I think the lawsuits become automatic these days. But again, to your point, let's not make the crisis any bigger.
Yeah, and you're 100% right. I've been the expert witness on 10 or 12 of the biggest class action lawsuits in the country years ago, and it doesn't take much anymore to get a couple $1 billion lawsuit going against the corporation. And honestly, most companies nowadays can't handle that. If you lose that lawsuit, you're done. There's a few companies that maybe could sustain that, but I agree with you. They're almost instantaneous nowadays. Within a day or two, they're launched. And that's not even talking about a class action lawsuit. I'm just talking about just a pure, you didn't do your fiduciary responsibility running the company and saying what if, and didn't react quick enough, you know. The other thing I would say, when it comes to critical incidents, and unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to look at it, I've run a lot of these things in my life, both in the government and the private sector. I think you need to have really strong stakeholder relationships. And what I mean by that, sort of an ongoing commitment between you and your teams that are going to fix everything, to include outside people, whether it's a law firm, cyber firm, PR firm, it doesn't really matter. Your banks, your CFO needs to be intimately involved in this, by the way. I see that person brought in a lot just when you want to pay stuff. That's not it. They need to understand where you're going when this crisis hits and how much money is going to go out the door. And that's really part of that preparedness and that continuous to say, as this goes on, because remember, if you do all this planning today and 4 years from now, the attack is launched or whatever it is, and you haven't touched it in 4 years, it's going to cost 10 times what you thought it was 4 years ago. And then, be accountable to your team and be accountable to what you're doing. And don't just think things are getting fixed. I'll give you one story real quick. We went to a company years ago that said, hey, we think we've been compromised in a cyber situation where somebody might have broken into our company. We do a whole bunch of pen testing, both externally and internally to the company. And we find a bad guy in an exact spot, and that we've told the company, here's where the bad guy was. We've shut it off. You need to fix this with your different teams in place. They said, sure. Almost a year to the day, I'm in Dallas, Texas, and my phone rings 5 times in 3 minutes from 5 different people in that company. And before I even called them back, I called the entire team together with a COO that were going to be responding to a major breach and said, I'm telling you right now, this company has a huge breach just because of what happened on my phone. And by the way, when I picked up the phone and called the first guy back, chaos. And guess where the breach came in? The exact place where we told them. Now, to me, there's no time for saying I told you so, but what in the hell? What are you doing?
Yeah. You assessed the vulnerability and did nothing about it.
What are you doing? And here's a situation where, trust me, that company was put into a crisis immediately. This is a major breach. Huge company. And if they would have just done a little bit of preparedness, if they would have taken the time to say, what if they would have just fixed what we told them to fix and not just looked at it like a line item that we'll get to next quarter or next year or whenever, they would have stopped that crisis. That little bit of proactiveness that they didn't do. And by the way, a lot of companies do this. So I'm not picking on that company. I'm just giving you a real life example. That actually happened. And, and on top of that, one of the biggest things that I saw after we went through it was there was zero crisis communication plan. Nobody had any idea. I mean, the other leadership in the company were brought into it late. It spiraled out of control for the first few days until we could get in there and get a hold of it and have some major meetings with them. And it just unnecessarily. You know,
you've responded to thousands of breaches, and going back to your point as an expert witness, I think that's critical, because it's these moments, when something's left, incomplete, and the lack of communication. I mean, as an expert witness, you look at every opportunity to demonstrate, what went wrong there.
If you got some guy like me coming in, Monday morning quarterback, everything that you've done, I'm going to look at every email, every internal communication, every P&L that you've put out for the last 10 years on your company around what you're trying to do it. Did you follow the crisis plan? Answer is absolutely no, most of the time. You're in big trouble, because let's say this, anybody can, 2020 hindsight, everybody has, right? You can all come in and Monday morning quarterback. But the reality is, if that's the way you've set it up, and by the way, if you don't listen to another thing I'm saying on this podcast, if anything like this happens in your company, whatever you do, don't write an email to the CEO or everybody saying, what in the hell's going on? And we talked about this 2 years ago. Why isn't it fixed? Because I can guarantee you that's coming up in the civil suit. And unfortunately, I'm saying this to you because everybody does that. Yeah. Have a way to communicate. That goes back to that crisis communication plan. Make sure your attorney's involved from the very beginning. And that's going to take training. And by the way, I'm not talking about training for your people. I'm talking about training for the executive team. The men and women that are responsible for all this, right? How are we going to communicate? What am I allowed to say? What am I not allowed to say? How are we going to bring the lawyers in on this? How are we going to secure immediately our critical resources that we need? By the way, these are all points you should be writing down if you're listening to this. And then what are the people that we need leading this, right? Because it may not be, going back to my statement, the CEO or the boss, right? You're going to report up to him or her, but that might not be the man or woman that needs to be running, depending what it is. I mean, I have no idea. We're planning for anything.
No, but you're making some really critical points. And when you think about that executive team, think about everybody on that executive team. We led a tabletop exercise one time, and we had a group. It was for a trade association, and we brought in member companies that all shared the role of CFO. And they sat in that room and were so surprised and said, "Thank you for doing this for us. We've never been a part of our company's tabletop exercises."
That's amazing.
And ironically, right? Because sometimes it's the CFO that learns about the breach because they have IT, operations under them. But to your earlier point, they're getting asked, how much is this going to cost me? They're signing contracts to get vendors in to do the recovery, yet they may have this IT operations under them at the same time. So,
yeah.
Everybody's going to have a role and responsibility in this, and some will be deeper than others, but make sure you communicate across the board and they know their role.
Well, communicate and transparency and honesty to your internal team. Look, as a publicly traded company or even a private company, you're going to be very methodical what the lawyers tell you to say publicly, but internally to the men and women who are helping you fight whatever this is, could be anything, transparency and honesty. Communicate, communicate, communicate.
Well, I would, just keep underscoring what you just said, because the hardest part is people want to have the answers when a crisis occurs.
Oh, I know.
And the reality of the situation,
I've been in that spot.
Yeah, you're not going to know, or the information is going to be completely wrong. It's kind of crisis communications 101. When you see a disaster that happens and they're reporting it on the news, the number of people injured, the number of people killed is always going to change as the situation unfolds. Same thing in nearly any crisis I've been involved in.
No, I agree. Look, you talk about people wanting to know answers. When I was in charge of the Ed Snowden investigation, I could tell you, I've been around people wanting to know answers. I mean, all the way up to the White House every day for months. But the reality is what you just said is right on. Here's the number one thing I can absolutely promise you in all the different critical incidents I've run and all the years I've done them in the private sector and the government. I guarantee you I'm right on this. Whatever you hear, whenever the guy or gal walks into your office and says, "Boss, this is a problem," whatever you hear in that first day, 2 days, 100% wrong. Bits and pieces of it might be right, bits and pieces, but you do not have the totality and the understanding of everything that's going wrong. And by the way, that's not because your people are all messed up or they're not doing a good job or they're not trying. It's the simple fact that in a crisis, again, going back to what we talked about, what is a crisis? Well, it's something that is not part of your daily activity. I don't care what it is. And so that is absolutely going to be wrong. So whatever you hear, and if you first hear this is really bad, stand by, because it's way worse than bad. And that's something as a leader or a leadership team, you need to understand. And that going back to the communication thing, you should have regularly set meetings. I don't care if everything's turned great 2 weeks later. You should keep those meetings in place, whether they're every hour, every 2 hours, every 4 hours, whatever you're trying to do with your leadership team, and then you'll break off into different operational components and all that. Regular updates, you're managing expectations, you're not lying, because clients are going to start asking, when can I get this? When can I get that? The only thing that's going to tick a client off more than you saying you're going to get it tomorrow is when tomorrow comes and they don't get it.
Yeah, you do not want to break that trust.
No.
And I do think this is an area where your team can spend time investing before the crisis occurs. We're not going to have the answers. The information we have is going to be incorrect. We need to anticipate that. But how can I speak confidently and hold that trust with a variety of stakeholders, your employees, your customers, your board, your regulators, and be able to say, this is what I know, this is what we're doing to figure out what we don't know, and this is when you're going to hear from me next. Keep that trust in place.
I mean, it's 100% right on. And you got to look at the team, and even why the evolution is going on, whatever's going wrong. I don't really care what it is. You have to be open-minded and continuously learning. And here's my point. I managed all these huge things in the FBI, huge. I learned so much just coming out into the private sector 10 or 11 years ago, and I learn every day. I don't care what kind of critical incident it is. So if you got a guy like me that's done a lot of this stuff globally, and some of it really bad, some of it kind of routine, and I'm telling you, I learn something every time I sit in one of these meetings. The people that have never done this, and this is your first time, don't keep mouthing off, and that's the only way I can say it. In some of these meetings, sometimes you got to take a step back on your own modesty and go, maybe I don't know everything. Maybe I need to listen to this guy or gal. And I use that word strongly because I've seen it. Now, if it happens enough around me, I don't really care where I'm at. And if you're hired me to come in and fix the stuff, I'm going to make a comment about the guy or gal mouthing off all the time. Now, that'll cause some consternation, but you know what? It passes because the reality is we're trying to fix the incident. You got to have clear communication channels. You got to be honest. You got to ask yourself, what if? And honestly, the transparency thing is key to your team. If your team doesn't know what's going on, if the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing, if the COO and the CFO don't know what each other's telling the clients or telling what everybody, the company comes off way worse than it may actually be. So I think there's some of the key points that I can think of, at least when we're talking about this in critical incident management.
I think preparedness is number one, top of the list.
Yeah, and I'll tell you one last thing before, I think we wrap this up. I mean, the reality is, I'll tell you what I did, and I still do it right now, whatever I'm in charge of. But nothing rings key to this more, and I'll tell you. So in my career in the FBI, I was the head of the Albuquerque field office for a while, and I was the head of the intelligence division at Washington field office for a while before I went back up to headquarters. And I will tell you, I had a 3x5 card that was taped to one of those desks. You know how you pull out like one of these old wooden desks and it has like a little thing you can write on? And that 3x5 card, I had, what's the first 4 things I do if an agent's shot? Not much more important than that. And unfortunately, I've used that card, right? I don't want to be thinking about that then. I want to know exactly what I'm going to be doing exactly at that time if something goes wrong. Do the same thing for your company. Do the same thing for your business. Do the same thing if, what happens if the person is supposed to pick my kids up for swim camp and they can't come? My point is, the time to be thinking about that is not at that time. It's beforehand. Why? Because you're calm, you're relaxed, you're thinking about a lot of things, and you can take your time. And when the emergency or the critical incident happens, you just go right down the list. And by the way, it doesn't need to be fancy. 3x5 card. I use it all the time. Matter of fact, I know there's a lot of companies out there right now using my 3x5 card. You can have the 120-page incident response plan and communication plan. I'm not saying you don't. But make it easy on yourself and make it easy on your team. Have very short, very achievable objectives, things you need to do immediately. I think we've hit this pretty good. So listen, thanks for tuning in. Can't wait to see you again on Let's Talk. Until I see you again, man, peace, love each other. We need it bad in this country. Thanks.